In this demonstration, we'll take a look at how to download Kali Linux. To download Kali Linux, you go to their website, which is worldwideweb.kali.org. Once on the kali.org website, you can see we have a quick little download link there. We could choose the download link, and also notice to the right, there is documentation on the kali.org website. Now, another way that we could download Kali is we could go to the Get Kali link up top. So I choose Get Kali, and you'll notice that they want us to choose our platform. The platform is how do you want to run Kali Linux. If your goal is to do an installation of Kali Linux on just a regular system, like a host system, then you'd be doing what we call a bare metal install, which is you're installing the operating system directly on hardware. So you would go and perform a bare metal download. And what will happen is you'll get an ISO file that you can then go and boot off of and start your installation of Kali if you wanted to. There are other options. So for instance, Kali.org does provide virtual machine image files. So there's VMware and VirtualBox pre-built images that you could download that you could then load into your virtualization environment, either VMware or VirtualBox. Now keep in mind, those are pre-built images. If you wanted to, you could do a bare metal download and then use that ISO file to install your own virtual machine as well. But they do give us pre-built images. There's other platforms that you can install Kali Linux on. So they do have ARM as a platform. They also have a mobile download, which is Kali NetHunter. They also have options for installing Kali into containers. So your first step when doing the download is to choose your platform. In this demonstration, I'm going to go with a bare metal install. So I'm going to download the bare metal download. Now, once we choose bare metal, it takes us to the bare metal section, and they give you a little overview of bare metal. And then also what they'll do is they'll give you links to installation documentation. So you can read over that documentation to get an overview of the installation process. Now, down below that, they'll have your different downloads for bare metal installs. And notice that up top here, they have the different architectures. So we have a 64-bit architecture, the downloads for 64-bit platforms. We have 32-bit downloads, and then we have Apple M1. So you choose your architecture that you want to download, and then you choose the download. So here I've got my 64-bit is selected. If I scroll down, there's a few options for 64-bit. We can go with just the installer, which is the typical offline installation program that allows us to customize the install. And that's kind of what I'm going to download here. There's a little download link. They let you know how big the download is. It's kind of in light gray text there. So that's 2.7 gigs is how big this download is going to be. But there are other options. So for instance, you could do an everything download, which includes every tool possible. And that's 9.4 gigs. And I could do an installation from this download if I wanted to. Or if you wanted to go and have the different packages downloaded during installation, so you want a smaller download, there is a net installer download that you could download, which is only 41 megs. And the reason why it's so small is because once you start this installation after you download it, it'll start downloading all the different packages to install the tools. Now, the most common scenario is you're just going to download the full installer, which is our 2.7 gigs, and it'll contain all of the common packages that you typically would have installed with Kali Linux. So I'm going to go with that option. I'm going to hit my download link, and you can see here the download starts. So it is going to take a little bit of time. It's 2.7 gigs. You can see it's going to take a couple hours here, but that's how we go and download the ISO for Kali Linux. In this demonstration, you saw how to download Kali Linux from the kali.org website. In this demonstration, we'll take a look at how to install Kali Linux. Now, for this demonstration, I've configured a virtual machine using Microsoft's Hyper-V to perform my installation. And just to take a look at the settings here, if I go to the File menu of my virtual machine and go to Settings, you can see here that I've configured the virtual machine to boot off of the ISO file that I downloaded in a previous demonstration. So what's going to happen when I start the virtual machine, it's going to boot off the ISO file, which will then start the installation. Now for bare metal installs, which involves you installing on just a regular machine, you would have taken your ISO file, burnt it to like a DVD, let's say, or maybe made a bootable USB stick. You'd insert those devices, whether it be the DVD or the USB stick, and then you power on the computer and it'll boot off the installation media and it will start the install. So very similar. So I'm going to hit the power button here, or the start button, and that'll start my virtual machine. As the virtual machine starts, you can see we do have our Kali main screen for the installation, so the Kali Linux installer menu, and we are going to do a graphical install. So I can use my up and down arrow keys here to select the type of installation, and we're just going to go with that graphical install, which is your typical installation for Kali Linux. Next, it wants us to go and choose our language, so I'm going to go with English here, and then choose continue. Wants us to choose our location, so you can choose your country. I'm just going to leave it here at United States. I'll accept the default, choose continue. Wants to know about our keyboard layout, so we'll go with American English, and then choose continue. Again, you would choose the layout that corresponds with the keyboard layout that you want to use. So the installation continues after we go and select our keyboard layout. So it'll take a few minutes here as it goes and loads our additional components. It's detecting our network hardware, configuring the network at this point. Here we can specify the host name for this Kali Linux system. I'm going to go with Kali 2022 as the name of the system and choose continue. Wants us to specify our domain name, so I'm just going to leave that domain name empty and choose continue. Wants to set up our users and passwords, so we can specify the full name for the new user account. I'm just going to go with student, and then it wants us to choose a username for that student, so I'll leave that at student as well. And now we want to type in a password for this account that we're creating during the installation. So you want to make sure that you know what this password is. A great option here is to show the password and choose continue. Then it wants to go and have us choose our time zone. I'm just going to leave that at Eastern and choose continue. Now it's going to set up the partitions. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go and do a guided install or configuration of the partition setup using the entire disk. I do want to use the whole disk that's available to this computer. So it shows our different hard drives. I only have the one hard drive here, so it's 136 gigs. Now because I'm installing this inside of a virtual machine there, it shows that it's 136 gigs virtual disk. Then it wants to know how we want to partition the drive itself, and we can go with a couple different setups here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to choose that all files are in one partition. So I'm just going to do a typical install here of Kali. Then it shows us a summary of our partitions. So we do have the first partition is a primary partition of 135 gigs, and then we do have a 1 gig swap partition. Wants us to commit these changes, so I select Finish Partitioning and Write Changes to Disk and choose Continue. It lets me know that if I continue, the changes listed below will be written to disk. Am I sure I want to continue? Yes, I am. So I choose Yes and then Continue. And now it's going to start installing the operating system. So this will take a few minutes. What I'll do here is I'll pause the video and then resume it once the files have completed copying. Okay, so now that Kali has copied the files, our next question is, it wants us to go and choose what software to install with the installation. So the first thing that you'll see here is we can choose our desktop environment. So we can go with Kali's default desktop environment, the XFE, or we can go with the GNOME or KDE environment. So I'll just leave it at the default and go with the desktop environment of XFCE. We can also choose the software that gets installed. So here we're just going to choose the collection of tools. the top 10 collection of tools, and then the default recommended list of tools. So we're just going to leave the defaults there and choose next. And now it's going to go and start installing the software. So after the software has been installed, our next question is whether or not we want to install the grub bootloader. And this is the operating system loader code when you boot up your operating system. So yes, we do want to install the grub bootloader. Then it wants to know which device we want to go and install the bootloader on. We're going to go and select the dev SDA, so our only drive in the system, and then choose continue. At this point, Kali is finalizing the setup, and this will take a few minutes. Once the setup is finalized, it'll give us a message to let us know that installation is complete and to press the continue button to reboot the system. At this point, the system is starting to reboot, and now we've got our Kali installed, and it wants us to choose the operating system. So we choose our OS, and Kali is booting. Once Kali is initialized and booted up, we'll then have to log in with our account that we created during installation, in our case, which is student. So we'll hit the logon button. And now we have our Kali installation, and we can see up top here we have the Kali menu and all of the other options. In this demonstration, we saw how to install Kali Linux. In this demonstration, we'll take a tour of the Kali Linux interface. Let's start by looking at the top left-hand corner. We do have our Kali menu, and if I click on the Kali menu, you'll notice that the menu pops up, and what's great about Kali Linux is they have all of the tools pre-installed and organized by the type of tool. So for instance, they have in our first category, information gathering tools. So here's where you'll find tools like Nmap and Maltego, all the different information gathering type of tools. Then we have vulnerability analysis as a category as well. And here's where they have the tools that are going to do vulnerability assessments of a target system. So for instance, Nikto is one of the tools that we can use to do a vulnerability scan of a web application, for instance, right? Legion is another popular vulnerability scanner that we can use. We also have web application analysis as a category in the menu, where you can see any of the tools that are used to assess the security of web applications. So that includes things like Burp Suite is a very popular tool, but also we'll see here sqlmap for doing SQL injection attacks. WPS Scan, which is used to assess the security of WordPress websites. So lots of web application analysis tools. We have database assessment as our fourth category. And again, we can see sqlmap is there to do SQL injection type attacks. They also have SQLDict, which is a dictionary attack tool against SQL servers. So lots of database assessment tools. We have password attack tools. So this is where we can see any password crackers. So John the Ripper is there. Medusa is another common one. Ophcrack is another popular password cracking tool. And Hashcat is another example of a very popular tool. The other thing that's kind of cool here is Cool, CEWL. And this tool is used to basically scan a website, collect words from the website, and build a dictionary file out of those words. We have wireless attack tools. So this is where we can see Kismet as a wireless scanner, and then also Reefer for cracking the WPS pins. And also we have here the Aaccess tools as well. Reverse engineering is where you'll find your different debuggers. So we can see a number of debuggers there to reverse engineer code. We have exploitation tools. This is where you'll find things like Metasploit. So the Metasploit framework is here, but also things like Armitage, which is kind of a graphical interface that sits on top of Metasploit, and also Beef as well as a attack framework. We have sniffing and spoofing as a category. And here's where you'll see any kind of tools related to sniffing traffic or spoofing the MAC address of the system that you're using. So for instance, MAC Changer is the tool that we can use to change our MAC address. Wireshark is a very common packet sniffer. Responder is used for man-in-the-middle type attacks. So lots of sniffing and spoofing tools there. Post-exploitation tools are after we exploit a system, we might want to use these tools to collect more information from the system. So a very common tool is Mimikatz, which is used to kind of grab the passwords from memory on that system. Although Kali Linux is focused on penetration testing and penetration testing tools, we do have a category 11 in the Kali menu is forensics tools. So we do have tools for us to capture forensic images, but we also have tools for analyzing forensics evidence. So things like autopsy is a very common analysis tool. We have reporting tools to help us piece together reports that are going to be used to show the results of the penetration test. So Maltego being a very popular tool. But also notice that there's a record my desktop as well, which could be used to kind of capture video of our process that we go through to collect information or to perform the assessment. And then down below that in category 13, we have social engineering tools. Really popular tools here are the Beef framework again for cross-site scripting type of attacks. And then also the social engineering toolkit or set is also another very popular social engineer attack tool. And then you get into common options like our system services in category 14. With system services, this is where we can go and stop and start Beef or stop and start other services related to some of the tools that are installed in Kali Linux. We also have Kali hyperlinks or Kali links. So this is where you can find documentation and launch the documentation for Kali Linux. You can go to the Kali forums if you wanted to, or view the documentation on all the different tools. Then we have the settings, and this is your typical operating system settings. So you can come in here and change things like your display settings and that if you wanted to. So that's our Kali menu, but that's not the only thing we have up the top left-hand corner. We have a couple buttons. We do have a minimize all windows button right beside the Kali menu button. We also have our folder list, so we can open up our folders. But then a lot of times we need a text editor. So they do have a simple text editor. And they also have a browser button up top. So if we want to launch a browser and navigate to a website, there's the browser, the web browser tool. And very common, we also have the terminal. So I can click that button and it's going to open a terminal session where I can start typing in commands with Kali Linux. Now over to the right here, we do have some other buttons. So you can see the time as well. We can change there's our network icon to see our network settings. We can change the volume level if we wanted to on the computer. We have our notifications icon as well to the right here to manage our notifications. We do have our computer icon as well. And then finally, we have the lock station button, so we can lock our screen. And then we have our power options. So if I hit the power options here, we can do a log out or we can restart the system or do a straight shutdown on the system if you want to switch user. So the typical power options that you would see in other operating systems like Windows, for instance. So in this demonstration, we toured the Kali Linux interface. In this demonstration, we'll take a look at how to install additional tools on Kali Linux. So the tool that we're going to look at installing is a third-party tool called Discover. Discover is a script that's used to automate passive and active scanning tasks during a penetration test. Now let's take a look at how to install this tool. First thing we'll do is we'll go to a terminal session. So I'm going to launch a terminal here. And then what I'm going to do is just, so you can see what I'm typing, I'm going to go and zoom in a little bit here. There we go. So the first thing that we want to do when installing tools is, first thing is we're going to go and retrieve any updated packages for Kali and perform the upgrade. So we're going to do a sudo space apt-get, and then we'll do an update, but also we'll do an apt-get upgrade. So we're doing two things at once, retrieving any updated packages and then going installing those packages. Once our password. So that'll take a few minutes. Now let's take a look at downloading our third-party tool or the additional tool that we want to install in Kali Linux, which is Discover. And we're going to do that by cloning the GitHub library So we're going to do a sudo command, git clone, and then we specify the URL to the tool in GitHub. And the tool is in a Leebird folder, who's the creator of the Discover tool. And then we're going to specify discover.git. And then we specify where we want to download this tool to. So I'm going to go and put it in my optional folder here, /discover, and then hit enter. So it's going to clone that tool. It only takes a second here. We can see that it's downloaded or received 100% of the objects. And now we're going to do a cd /opt/discover. And then we'll do an ls command here so we can see the files that were downloaded from that GitHub library. And what we're going to do here is we're going to run the tool with the update. So we're going to do a sudo /update.sh. So we're going to update the tool. So this installs the tool onto our system. And then what we'll do after the installation is we'll go and run the tool. So running the update.sh file or script in order to install the Discover tool took about 15 to 20 minutes. So it did take quite a bit of time. But once it's installed, you can run it. Let's verify that it's actually installed by running it. So I can do a ./discover.sh. And we can see here, when I run it, it's a menu-based tool where I can choose option number 3 to generate a target list, option number 4 to do CIDR, 6 to work with an IP range, and so on. So in this demonstration, you saw how to install software on Kali Linux. In this demonstration, we'll take a look at how to perform a port scan within Kali Linux. To start the whole process, what we're going to do is we're going to launch a terminal session. So we hit the terminal emulator button up top on the Kali toolbar. Now in this example, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit so you guys can see the text a bit better. There we go. And now we're ready to start doing port scans. Now the program that we use to do a port scan is called Nmap, which stands for Network Mapper. And it can be used to do ping suites and port scans. There's also extensions to it that allows us to run scripts that can do vulnerability checks if we wanted to on systems. So you can type Nmap and hit enter. And what happens is it comes up with basically a help information, giving you a list of all the options and parameters that you can use with Nmap. So for example, notice here they're saying that -sn will do a ping scan for us, and it disables the port scan functionality. Now my goal is to show you how to do a port scan, but I want to go through the whole pen test process, as far as this phase goes, with performing a port scan. But before we do a port scan, we do like to do a ping sweep and see what systems are up on the network. So that's what we want to take a look at. So my first command is we're going to do an nmap, and then we have a space, a -s for scan. Then what we can do is a capital letter that represents the type of scan. In this case, I'm going to do a capital letter P for a ping sweep. And then you've got some options here. I'm going to put a space, and you could do things like specify an entire network block if you want. So in this case, I can do a ping sweep of the whole 10.0.0 network by specifying that network ID / and the CIDR notation that represents the subnet mask. Now in this case, I'm not actually going to do that whole network. That's 16 million addresses, and that'll take a little bit of time. So I don't want to do that whole network. So what I'm going to do is just do a ping sweep of the one system that I want to see, is that system up and running. So it's 10.0.0.1. Again, I want to stress we could do the whole network by doing .0/24. But for time purposes, we're just going to do the one system. So I hit enter, and then it goes and runs the scan, and it comes back and says, okay, Nmap is starting the scan. The system is mail.certworld.loc, 10.0.0.1. Host is up. It tells you how long it took. Nmap completed, 1 IP address, 1 host up, and it's 0.13 seconds. Now, this looks kind of silly because it says 1 IP address, but we only scanned 1 address. So it looks silly in the sense that, well, of course it's only 1 IP address, but keep in mind, had we have done the whole network range, it'll come back with a list of what systems are up and running, and it'll give you a summary at the bottom. It'll say 10 IP addresses, it'll say how many IP addresses were scanned and how many hosts are up within that scanned IP addresses range. So you might get 10 hosts up, for instance, right? So that's the idea of the output here. Now that's just a ping sweep. So you can do a ping sweep, find out what systems are up and running. Now I use -sp, and that's a traditional command that's been around with Nmap for quite some time. And to me, it makes sense. I'm doing a scan, but it's a ping sweep scan. But as you saw in the help, we could also do nmap-sn 10.0.0.1. So SN will also do a ping sweep for us, right? And the reason why I mention that is a lot of the newer certifications, they test on the newer switch. So the -SN versus the -SP. So the next thing is I want to do a port scan. So now that I know that 10.0.0.1 is up and running, now I'm wondering what ports are open. And the ports will help you identify ways into the system, right? And what services are running. So for instance, if port 80 is open on a system, I can kind of assume it's probably got a website running, right? And then I might look at what my attack vectors are for websites or web applications. But let's do a port scan. So we do an nmap-s for scan, and then a capital letter implying the type of scan. In this case, I'm going to put a capital letter T. This is what we call a TCP connect scan. And with a TCP connect scan, what happens is Nmap will try to connect to all of the common ports on a system, like port 21 is the FTP port, port 80 is the web port, right? Port 3389 is the remote desktop port. So it'll try to connect to each one of those port numbers using a full three-way handshake, right? So our system sends a SYN message, the target system sends a SYN ACK back, and then we send an ACK back. So the idea is if we can make a full connection to the port, then that port must be open, is the mentality of Nmap. So we're going to do a full TCP connect scan. So -ST, and then you specify the IP address. Now notice that I'm not specifying the ports that I want to scan here. So I did hit enter. And the reason why I did that is I do want to use whatever the default list of ports is that Nmap uses. So it does scan all the common ports. And you can see here, this target system that I'm using does have quite a bit of services running. So you can see it does have an FTP site. It does have DNS, so it is a DNS server. It does have a web server. It does have Kerberos running, right? It also has LDAP. It is running the Microsoft Directory Services. What else is interesting here? So those are some common ones that kind of stick out. And the point is that, when you're performing a penetration test, you would then research all these port numbers to find out, okay, what do these ports, what do they do, right? So you start doing some research, find out what the ports are, and then eventually you find out, okay, how can I attack the system knowing that that port is open? So that is the -ST, which did a TCP connect scan. Now, from a hacker's point of view or a pen tester's point of view, they don't want to do a TCP connect scan because there's 3 different packets that are sent. The SYN message goes to the target system, then the ACK SYN comes back, and then the hacker system or the Nmap system sends an ACK back. So there's 3 different packets for every port, which is traffic on the network. So the goal is when we're kind of scanning the network, we want to try and create less traffic because the more traffic, the higher the chances are that you're going to get detected. So we do have other Nmap options. So I can do an nmap-s for scan, and then a capital character to imply the type of scan we're doing, which is capital S. In this case, we're going to do what they call a SYN scan, which means just send a SYN message Like, don't do a full three-way handshake, TCP three-way handshake. Just send the SYN message, and if we get the reply back, there's no need to send the final ACK. So it's less packets being delivered. But you'll notice that the results are the same. So if I do a SYN scan and I hit enter, oh, sorry, I got to have root privileges to do a SYN scan. So I'm going to do a sudo nmap -ss 10.0.0.1, type in my password. And what I want you to see here is the results are going to be the same, right? So we still see the port information. So it's just more internally, how is the scan being performed? We didn't do full three-way handshakes, which technically is less traffic. So we're trying to avoid some detection is kind of the idea there. So that's a SYN scan, but again, the results look the same. Now, the other thing that we can do with Nmap, and I'll go with a TCP connect scan, is you can pick your port numbers. And where this is useful is not just from a hacker's point of view, but even like as a network administrator, management comes up to me and says, Glenn, we heard there's a new vulnerability with the remote desktop feature of Windows. Do we have systems running remote desktop? Well, the cool thing is you could turn around and say, okay, I'm going to do a port. That would be a great practical use of a port scan. I'm going to do a port scan, but I only want to scan for port 3389 because I know that's the port that remote desktop uses by default. And then you can specify, again, the whole network, 10.0.0.0/24. In my case, I don't want to do the whole network just for time purposes. So I'm just going to do one specific address. So here what I'm doing is I'm using the lowercase p to specify the port number specifically that I want to scan for. And it comes back and says, oh, 3389 is open on that system. So I do know that this 10.0.0.1 system, not only is it a web server and an FTP server, it's also running remote desktop. So that's interesting. And you can also specify multiple ports. So if I do nmap -st-p for port, and I want to specify my port numbers, I can say, okay, check for port 3389, check for port 2180, and let's go 25 for SMTP, right? So I specify my port numbers, and then I specify the IP address of the system I want to scan. So now it's going to check for those 4 port numbers, and you can see 21 is open. The reason why I picked 25 is I wanted to pick one that wasn't open on the system. And you can see here 25 is filtered, so it's not open on the system. 80 is open, and 3389 is open, right? So those are, 3 potential target ports if I was doing a pen test that I would try to exploit to gain access to the system. So another example of a switch, there's many different switches for Nmap, but another example that's very common is we can do, let me clear the screen here, we can do an Nmap -SV. I'm going to do an SV, which means don't only give me the fact that the port is open or closed, but tell me the version of the software, so V means version, that's opened that port. So if I do -SV and I do 10.0.0.1, I'm going to hit enter. Now remember, we saw last time that the FTP port was open on this system. This time we should see what software opened the port. And when I scroll up here, notice that we can see port 21 is not only open as an FTP service, but the version of the software is, this is the Microsoft FTP D for Daemon, I guess. So it's the Microsoft FTP service, right? Notice port 80 is open, but now I can see, it's Microsoft IIS HTTPD 10.0. So the great thing is now I'm starting to see the version of the software that's opened that port. Now I can start doing some research into how do I exploit a Microsoft IIS HTTPD 10.0. So now you know the version of the software. Now you find out what exploits exist for that. So that's very interesting. And then one other command that I wanted to point out is we can also try to do operating system detection as well. So we can add to that. A lot of times we'll do an Nmap -sv for I want to do a port scan, but I want version information. But I'm also going to do a -o, make sure that was an O I put in, for operating system fingerprinting. Identify the operating system, and 10.0.0.1. And what's going to happen is, lets me know I have to run that with root privileges. So I'll throw a sudo nmap sv in front of that. And yeah, so what this is going to do is it's going to attempt to figure out what the operating system platform is. Again, which is useful because if you're performing a pen test, now that you know the OS, now you can start researching vulnerabilities with that operating system. So down below here, warning OS scan results may, so it lets you know that the results may be unreliable, right? So they're just saying OS is Windows. Okay, so that wasn't super specific. A lot of times in the results, it'll attempt to kind of let you know what version of Windows it believes it is. So it looks like it wasn't able to detect much more than just, hey, this is a Windows operating system. In this demonstration, you saw how to use Nmap to perform a port scan. In this demonstration, we'll take a look at how to use Hydra to crack passwords. The first thing that we want to do is create a user list file and a password list file that we can use with Hydra. So I'm going to launch a text editor up top on the toolbar there. And the first thing I want to do is create the list of user accounts here. And these are user accounts, maybe common accounts that people typically use that you would like to attempt to crack passwords for. So maybe there's a user called Bob, one called Sue. A lot of times there's a user called root, maybe admin, maybe administrator, maybe Glenn, right? So you create your user list file. Now I'm going to save this user list file. So I'll do a file, save it to my home folder here, and I'm going to call it userlist.txt. So note that it's 6 usernames in the background there. You can see 6 different usernames. And what we can do is we can get Hydra to try to crack the passwords of those 6 usernames. Now I'm going to create another file here. So I launched another text editor, and I'm going to create a password list file. Now I'm purposely going to create a very small password list file for demonstration purposes, but keep in mind that you would use some of the sample password list files that come with Kali Linux to try to crack passwords. So you'd use, the very common RockU file, for instance. So I'm going to just type a short list in here of common passwords, right? So pass1, password, maybe 1234, password 1234. Our actual password for the account that I'm using here is capital PA $$W0RD. So I'll put that in there. But notice that I put it towards the end. So what I want to do is when we run Hydra to crack passwords using the user list file and the password list file, I do want to see as it attempts each password. So that's why I'm putting the actual password towards the end of the list. And I don't know, test 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so let's save this as a password list file. So I do file save as, and we're going to call this passlist.txt. Save, and I'm going to close that down. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go into a terminal session here. Let me zoom in a little bit so that you can see my screen, or my text, I should say, as I type. And so we created the user list file, we created the password list file. Now we're going to use Hydra to use those text files to crack passwords. So you use Hydra space, and the first parameter that I'm going to specify is a -L. And capital L is used to specify the list of user accounts, right? So this will be userlist.txt. Now, I should also mention that if you knew the username that the target system was using, what you could do is instead of a capital L, you could use a -lowercase l. And you could actually type the username, administrator. You could type the actual username that you want to use. In this case, I want to use the contents of the text file, which is a potential usernames. So it's capital L is the parameter. So capital L, and then user list.txt. And then same thing for the password. If you know that you have one specific password you want to attempt, you could use a dash lowercase p, and then you could type in that password. But if you want to use the contents of a file, it's a capital P instead of a lowercase p. So I do capital P passlist.txt. So what's going to happen here is Hydra is going to look at the first username that exists in this user list file, and it'll try every password that's in the pass list file for that one user. Then it goes to the second user in the user list file and tries all the passwords from the pass list file. And that continues for each username that's in the user list.txt file. Now, as our next parameter, you specify the IP address. So in our case, it's 10.0.0.1 is the system that I'd like to try to crack the passwords for. So that actually is a Windows server. It's running, a number of services. It's running an FTP site. It's running a HTTP site. It also has remote desktop enabled. So the administrator remotes into the server to do their day-to-day administration. So the cool thing is that after you specify the IP address, then you would go and specify the protocol that you want to use. And this is what I like about Hydra. So Hydra encapsulates the password attack into whatever protocol you want to use. So if I know it's an FTP server, sure, throw all that traffic into, FTP traffic. And let's see if we can crack the authentication for FTP. So I'm going to hit enter here, and there are other protocols. So I'm going to demonstrate RDP as well afterwards. But you could also do it for SSL and HTTP, POP3, SMTP, VNC. There's a big list of protocols that Hydra can encapsulate the attack into to try to figure out what the password is. So I'm going to hit enter here, and you can see that it comes up and it says, okay, we are going to attack the FTP :/10.0.0.1:21. And it comes up here and says, okay, the host 10.0.0.1 login is administrator and password is this. So it has figured out a username and password, but it's still running. So it's reading through those files and it's trying additional usernames and passwords, and they're just finished. So it comes up and says, okay, we found one valid password, and they displayed it on the screen. So if there were multiple valid passwords, it would show those valid passwords. Now, a lot of times when I run any kind of password cracking tool, I'd like to see the attempts as it's working, just so I know it's actually doing something. So the other thing you can do, I'm going to use my up arrow here to go to my previous command. So it's Hydra -L, my user list.txt, -P, my password list, 10.0.0.1, and then the protocol is FTP. The other thing that you could do is you could do -V verbose logging, where it actually displays on the screen all of the usernames and passwords that it is attempting, right? So we can see up here, it's starting with the user Bob, and it's trying each of the passwords from the password list file. And then eventually, once it exhausts all those, then it moves to the next username, tries all of the same passwords from the password list file, and it continues that process. And then eventually, you can see here, it did find the username and password. Perfect. So the other thing that I want to show you, because it is a very common protocol, is RDP, remote desktop. Right? So a lot of people will enable remote desktop on their Windows system so that they can remote into the system from anywhere and be able to administer the system. So when you're assessing security, one of the things you could do is you could use a tool like Nmap, and I can say, okay, I'll do a TCP connect scan for systems that run port 3389, which is the RDP port, and then you can type in the IP range. So, for instance, that should be 8 for a Class A, but let me do /24 to say, okay, let's scan, the Class C network of 10.0.0, and let's see if there's any systems that are running RDP. So I hit enter there, and what I'm doing here is I'm trying to discover, okay, what computers on the network are running RDP. And I can see here that it has found 10.0.0.1, which is got RDP port open, right? Looks like 10.0.0.100 also has the RDP port open, right? So now I've got a list of some systems. Looks like 101 is another computer, and it's got the port closed. So now I have a list of two systems, 10.0.0.1 and 10.0.0.100, that has the RDP port open. So now what I could do, I'll just use 10.0.0.1 as the example, is now I could use Hydra and say, okay, let's go and try and see if we can crack the password using RDP. Now, you might say, why would you do this? You just figured out what the password is of that administrator account, and that's absolutely true. But I loaded the FTP service on that Windows server. A lot of organizations won't have FTP as a protocol. I used it as my first example, but a more realistic protocol that would be running on all Windows servers might be RDP, because again, administrators use it to remotely administer the machines. So the end result is going to be the same here, but notice that I've changed the protocol to RDP. And I use the -v, so it is showing each of the usernames and passwords being attempted. And we can see here that it was successful in figuring out, oh, we can actually log in with administrator with capital PA $$W0RD. So in this demonstration, you saw how you can use Hydra to perform password cracking on systems. In this demonstration, we'll take a look at how to use sqlmap to perform SQL injection attacks against a web application. Now let's start by showing you my sample web application here. I have a quick little application that connects to a database, and it retrieves a list of products. So you can see we have 5 products here, hammer, saws, and wrenches for different colors and different prices. I can also, if I wanted to, take a look at a specific product. In this web application, there is a viewproduct.asp page where there's a question mark ID equals 3. 3 is the ID number of the product that I want to take a look at. So notice this time I'm just looking at product ID 3. And if I want to change that to a 5, for instance, now I'm looking at ID number 5. So a lot of web applications are developed that way. You get the big product list, but then you click a link, and really it's just showing you the information for that one product based off the ID that's up in the URL. That's what we call a query string. So this is important for you to see, because this is how you know the URL that you want to test against, right? So you're using the web application, you're looking at the customer that's hired you to do the penetration test, and you're testing at their web app, and you're saying, okay, they've got a product list here, and it looks like they do have a web page that does require an ID to be passed in. So this is information that could be supplied to the web application. So how does that web application respond with other types of information supplied? And that's the whole idea of SQL injection attacks. We're injecting random information into the web application so it passes it on to the database server in the background. Now, SQL injection attacks, you can write SQL code yourself into the web application and try to manipulate how the web application functions by writing that SQL code. But one of the benefits of sqlmap is it's a program that makes it easy for you to perform SQL injection attacks without knowing the SQL code. You just got to learn the parameters and the different ways that we can use sqlmap instead of learning SQL syntax itself. So that's what we want to take a look at here is let's test this web application and see if we can learn information about this web application. So for instance, the web application does have a logon page. If I go back a little bit here, if I just hit the main site of the web application, so there is a logon page. If I don't know a username and password, I'm not going to get logged in. Got to go back to the login page, right? So it'd be nice to know what those usernames and passwords are. So let's launch a terminal session. Let's take a look at how to use sqlmap. Let me zoom in a little bit here. Perfect. So first command that I want to show you is sqlmap. I'm going to use a -u, which is the URL that you want to perform the SQL injection attack against. This is why I showed you the URLs at the beginning of the demo, because you would know the URLs from just browsing the website. So we know, okay, there's a view product.asp?id = 3. And notice that that URL is placed in single quotes. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and enter that in, hit enter. And what this is going to do is it's basically just going to test the URL to see, is this URL vulnerable to SQL injection attacks? Now, you are going to notice I am going to get prompted every time I type a command in here, because it's basically saying that the web server wants to set a cookie value. And do I want to allow that? Yes, I do. So what happens is that this sends basically a bunch of commands in the background to the web application, and the web application is going to let us know if it looks like this application is vulnerable to SQL injection attacks. And also it'll collect information about the web application and the backend database. So here it says the backend database, so it sends some commands up, and based off the results of how the system handled those commands, it comes back and says the backend database is a Microsoft SQL Server. The web server operating system is Windows 10, 2016, or 2019. And the actual web application is either ASP.NET, Microsoft IIS 10, or ASP. And it's actually a little ASP site I just quickly made. And then here it lets you know the platform. So it is a SQL Server 2019. So the point is that it was able to discover information about the underlying database environment. What's kind of cool about sqlmap as well is it does write the output to files. So it's kind of showing us the output here, which is great. When you're doing a pen test, you want to be able to, in the report, include some of the output. So the output is inside these files, which is kind of nice, right? So the great thing is right now I know that, okay, this is a Microsoft SQL Server environment running on a Windows platform. And yeah, know a little bit there. Now the next thing we want to do is let's build off that. So after I specify, just do a test of that URL, now what I'd like to do is get a database list. So I'm going to use the --dbs for database system parameter. Notice that it's the same sqlmap command. So the whole time when you use sqlmap, you're supplying the URL that includes a parameter like ID = 3. So that way the commands can go up to that page that ID = 3 is being sent up there. And then underneath the scenes, sqlmap is sending other commands to find out information about the underlying environment. So here I want to know, what are the names of the databases that exist in this platform? So I use the --dbs. Now you will notice here again it says, hey, the server wants to set cookies. Do you want us to allow that? And I'm going to choose yes. And then what happens is we get the same information here. Backend database is SQL Server. Here's the version of the operating systems that potentially are running the SQL Server. There's the web application technologies that potentially could be used. So all this is important because you'll document that, you'll research, how do I exploit those environments? What kind of vulnerabilities exist, with these operating systems and with these technologies? That's not really what I'm interested in here. What I'm trying to do is I'm using sqlmap to learn about the underlying database, right? So, it's a website that has a list of products and prices and all that good stuff. So here I'm saying, show me the databases that exist. That's why I use the --dbs parameter. And it says there's 5 databases. There's a master database called model, one called MSDB. Those are default databases that exist on SQL Server. Same with tempdb. So really the only unique database here is a database called productsdb. So I'm thinking, okay, that's got to be the database that the website is using to store its list of products, right? And don't forget as well that the application requires us to log on. So there's probably a user list there as well. So now that I know a database that exists in the underlying database environment, now I want to retrieve a list of tables from that database. So I'm going to use my up arrow here, And notice that it's the same command. So sqlmap-u, the URL that you would typically navigate to get to that site. And instead of a --dbs, this time what we're going to do is say --tables. Give me a list of tables for the -d for database products DB. And I know this is the database because I can see it right there. So give me a list of tables from that database. So I hit enter. It says, hey, the server wants to set cookies. Do you want to allow that? Sure. And again, it comes up with the results. It says, okay, the database products DB has two tables. It has a products table and a users table. So I'm thinking, oh, okay. Well, let's get a list of columns that exist in the products table. And after I get a list of columns, then I want to get a list of the data. So again, I just build on the command. So instead of --tables, now I'm going to say, give me a list of columns for the -t, the table of products, in the database products DB. Hit enter. Do you want to set the cookie? Sure. So it comes up and says, okay, the database products DB, the table products has 4 columns. There's a color column, there's a name column, there's a price column, and there's a product ID. And what's really interesting here is they're also showing you the data type. So notice how easily I'm able to start discovering the structure of the database, the tables and the columns and the data types. But not only that, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw a --dump on the end, which means dump all the data as well, which means show me the data that exists in the tables. So this is important for you to see here because I'm not surfing the website. I am using sqlmap, and now I'm looking at the actual underlying data that exists in those tables. And that's the data that existed within when I looked at the web page, right? So I just added a --dump to that. Now, let me clear the screen so my command's at the top here. So I'm going to do that again, but let's look at the other table. So it's sqlmap-u, the URL for the website that includes a parameter, --columns, -t for the table. Now this time what I want to do is I don't want to look at the products table. I want to look at the other table was the users table. And maybe before I dump the data, let's just look at the columns that exist in the users table, sorry. So we can see there's 2 columns. There's a logon name and a password column. Interesting. And again, that's the products DB database, the users table. So now let's add the --dump. So show me the columns that exist in this users table that's within the products DB database, but also dump the data to the screen. So what's important here is this is the table where usernames and passwords are stored. So here they're saying, okay, the database is products DB, table is users. There's 2 fields or 2 columns, a logon name and a password. And then here's the entries or the data that exists. So now I can see the logon name and the password for 2 different user accounts for that website. So let me try the B Smith and the password. So I'll go back to my logon page and I'll use B Smith with my password, and I'm able to get into the site. So in this demonstration, you saw how to use sqlmap to perform SQL injection attacks and discover information about the underlying database environment. In this demonstration, we'll take a look at how to use Ophcrack to crack Windows passwords. Let's start the discussion by exploiting a system and stealing the password hashes from that system. And then what we'll do is we'll load those password hashes into Ophcrack and see if we can crack the password hashes. So to exploit a system, we're going to go into Metasploit with MSF console. Once we get into Metasploit, what we're going to do is we're going to use or load up an exploit to attack a system. So I'm going to use exploit /Windows. Now this is an SMB exploit, so we'll use SMB as the category, and then MS17. Now I can use tab to autocomplete. After we select an exploit, we should always go with a show options, just to take a look at what options need to be set before we can run this exploit. And we can see here that the rhost option is required, and it currently has no setting. So the rhost option is the system that we want to attack. So in this example, I'm going to set our host to 10.0.0.100, which is my target system. Shows that our host has been set. Now we're going to exploit the system, and hopefully we'll get into that system. Once we get into that target system, then what I want to do is steal the hashes, the password hashes from the SAM database of that system. So we can see here at the bottom of the screen, it shows win, letting us know that we're in the system. Notice also that I'm in a meterpreter prompt, so I can use meterpreter commands here. And hash dump is one of the meterpreter commands that you can use to retrieve the password hashes from the target system. Nice clean command, nice clean output. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select those user accounts. These are the user accounts that exist in the system, in the SAM database of the system that we exploited. And I'm going to copy those. Now I'm going to launch a text editor up top here. And I'm going to paste those into a file. And then let's save that file. So I'm going to save it to, let's say, my documents folder. And we're going to call it hashdump Ophcrack demo. Perfect. Now that we have the password hashes, I'm going to exit out of Meterpreter and then out of Metasploit. I've kind of achieved my goal with that exploitation, was to grab the password database, so the password hashes from the system. Now that we have a copy of the passwords on our system, now we're going to go and see if we can crack those password hashes. So if we go to the Kali menu up top, we can go to password attacks, and then over to the right, you have a number of different password cracking tools. In this demonstration, I want to show you Ophcrack. Now, Ophcrack has a number of different techniques that you can use to use it. The first thing is I should mention is I'm using it here as kind of a graphical tool to load in some password hashes. But you could load in a SAM database file, which is the file that has all the usernames and password hashes on a Windows system. So had you have grabbed the actual file itself, you could do that. And you could load that in here and crack the passwords that exist in the SAM database of a system. So my point is that you can use it as kind of a graphical tool to crack password hashes that you have somewhere. But the other thing you can do is you can actually use this as a bootable live CD, or put it on a USB stick so that you can boot directly to Ophcrack and crack the passwords of a local system if you wanted to. So a couple different ways that you can use it. First thing I want to mention here is on the Progress tab, you would see all the usernames and password hashes that we're attempting to crack. I haven't loaded the file that contains the password hashes yet, so that's why that's empty. But down bottom, you can see that there is a rainbow table that's been loaded, and the rainbow tables speed up the cracking process because they have pre-built hashes into them. And what happens is during the cracking process, Ophcrack will compare the password hashes that exist in the user account file that you have against the rainbow tables to find out what the password is. Now, I want to mention I've already installed the rainbow table here, but you can go to the tables button up top here and you can install the different rainbow tables. So you can see a lot of them are not installed by default in Kali Linux. So you can select it, hit the install button, and it'll ask you, where have you downloaded those rainbow tables? And you can get those from the Ophcrack site where we go and download Ophcrack as well. So just a little heads up, I do have a rainbow table loaded, and I did that through the tables tab there. Now what I want to do is I want to load up my file. Now you can go and like I said, you can actually grab the SAM database and you can load that in here. I'm going to do a session file, which is just a file that I created that contains password hashes in it. So I'm going to choose session file, And I'm going to go with the file that we created a few minutes ago, which is the hash dump Ophcrack demo. Select that, choose open. Let me just maximize the window here. So you can see here the user accounts and the password hashes. So here's all the different password hashes. And these password hashes are resulting values of running the actual plain text password through a hashing algorithm to generate this value. So we need to kind of figure out, okay, what is the actual plain text word is that hash? So that's kind of what our goal is here. So after you go and load the file, then what you're going to do is run the crack. So we hit the crack button here. Notice again, tables is up there. So we hit the the crack button, and it goes and it loads the rainbow table into memory for speed. And you can see it's starting to crack the passwords. So it looks like user 3 has a password of host 7. Looks like user 5 has a password of pass1. Looks like user 2 has a password of kids, right? So you can kind of see it's starting to work there, and it's showing our progress here. So you can see it's slowly kind of working. So it's going to take some time to run this password crack, but you can see already we're starting to get some results, and we're starting to figure out what the passwords are for the user accounts that are on that target system. In this demonstration, you saw how to use Ophcrack to crack password hashes.